This Choircast podcast is brought to you in part by the Liminal Living Podcast. Liminal, a word 1,000 miles wide but small enough to fit into the present moment. It describes an in-between place. We live most of our lives within this space, not quite ever arriving at our idealistic final destination. We spend so much of our energies on our best impersonation of who we wish we were, until we can't. But in sneaks a dark night of the soul, or perhaps a mystical experience. Our way of being has an error loop introduced. Today we call that deconstruction. Welcome to the Liminal Living Podcast, where we teach you how to be here, how to traverse these spaces, and where we can go if we remain humble, open, and honest.
It's time for another round of Snarky Faith with your host, Stuart Deloney. This is a space where we irreverently wrestle through life, culture, and spirituality, all with our heads in the clouds, our tongues in our cheeks, our hearts in our sleeves, and our feet on the ground. At Snarky Faith, the questions or even the answers are never the point. It's all about the conversation. So here's your host, Stuart Deloney.
Welcome back to Snarky Faith. I'm Stuart Deloney, your guide through the wilderness of spiritually disenfranchised radio. Had enough of the insanity in Christianity? Well, you've come to the right place. We're here on a quest for a sane, grounded faith that aims to make the world better in real, tangible ways. We're not afraid to call out the religious BS or to look for better pathways forward. If your conversations about faith require a heavy dose of
sarcasm
and even a bit of this, then welcome home. You can find this and all past episodes at snarkyfaith.com or wherever else you listen to podcasts. We're here, we're there, we're practically everywhere. Just look for Snarky Faith.
Previously on Snarky Faith.
Money ain't your problem. Management is. Tithing and offering is God's management training program for mankind.
Oh, preach it, sister. You gotta love a good tithing sermon that really just puts the screws on the fact that, hey, the reason y'all don't have money is because you aren't giving us enough money. That doesn't really seem like it makes any sense. Like, even in the quantum realm, it makes no sense. But hey, we actually will be talking about the quantum sayings of Jesus with Keith Giles later in the show today. We're going to be talking about the Gospel of Thomas within that. But before we get to that, I need to address something. May is Mental Health Awareness Month. And you know one sphere of the world that does an awful job with mental health in general and being able to help people with that? Yeah. Places of faith, churches, right? But no, we don't talk about this because this is a spiritual issue. It's a spiritual issue. But it really isn't. It really isn't at all. So why do I bring this up? Yes, it's Mental Health Awareness Month, but let's get real. Because awareness is really just the tip of the iceberg. Now, I have faced some harsh realities lately. A couple of close friends have lost their battles with mental health. It's been really, really painful. I think it's in 4 months. I've had 2 people that I knew very, very well that took their lives. And this got me thinking about the larger conversation, or really just like lack there of a larger conversation in many of our churches and faith circles today. And how are we really handling mental health crisis in the pews? Like, are we doing enough? Now, if you've ever been told to just pray away your depression or anxiety, you know exactly what I'm talking about. This isn't helpful. It's dangerous. It's like telling someone with a broken arm to just wave it around until it feels better. Prayer is powerful, yes, but mental illness often requires professional intervention. I speak as a person who has struggled with anxiety and depression my entire life. This is not something that pastors are equipped to be able to handle. Because there's this whole idea that like a semester of counseling at a seminary will turn pastors into therapists. Like, come on. That's not just oversimplified. It's just damn irresponsible. Would you trust somebody who took a first aid course once on performing, I don't know, what, open heart surgery? Yeah, I didn't think so. I didn't think so at all. I've been through seminary. And yes, it's nice to have a class on counseling and understanding, being able to listen and help others. That is great. But a therapist, it does not make you. And if you act like it does, that is just the hubris of the pulpit in action. So here we are, with people struggling silently, sitting in church pews every Sunday, carrying burdens that go far beyond anything a quick prayer or a pastoral pat on the back could ever heal. It's a silent epidemic. And if people think that churches are there to care for the flock, they're not really. And if they think they are, they're really usually ill-equipped. But something I've been trying to process through, just weirdness and grief. That we need to turn the tables on this idea. It's not enough to just talk about mental health once a year when the calendar tells us to, but what if our spaces of community and faith were as dedicated to mental wellness as they are to spiritual growth? Whoa, what a thought! I know. I can imagine a place where it's not only safe to speak about your mental health and your trauma, but it's a space where you can also be encouraged to heal. And really what this means, especially in an institutionalized church setting, people need to bring professionals in. Can pastors play a crucial role in spiritual lives? Sure, but they are not mental health professionals. They're not the ones that are equipped to guide people through trauma and pain and suffering in their own moments of darkness. I mean, so why not? Why don't more churches have therapists on staff? Like, we expect the pastor because he's the guy that knows everything. He's the one. He's the one. But I know, most of this is going to be falling on deaf ears because I know the churches really just don't care about this kind of stuff. And we get into this mode where you're just like, yes, pray the trauma away. And it does not work. As a person who has spent time in therapy, praying it away does not fix it. But how can we fix this? What can we do to fix this? Well, I think the biggest thing is to start beginning to breaking the stigma of this. I mean, it's 2024 for God's sakes, and we're still like whispering about mental health issues in Christian circles like there's some sort of medieval taboo. If Jesus taught us anything, it's that we should be bearing one another's burdens, not adding to them and or cloaking them in shame. So as we make our way through Mental Health Awareness Month, I think we need to make a decision, to be aware of what's happening, but to get actively involved in helping others. I mean, awareness is beautiful. It's beautiful. But awareness without action, what is that? Just a tweet? Or it's not tweets anymore. I don't know. What is it, an X? It's just stupid and a whole nother conversation. But for those of us that try to walk after the ways of Christ, is this a time for us to demand more? of leaders and our communities and of ourselves, because mental health isn't anything that's seasonal. It's a human issue. And it's time that we treated it with the compassion and seriousness and dedication that it deserves. Because guess what? This is snarky faith. I can't get too sappy here. I can't get too emotional with this. But we need to be able to take conversations out of the shadows and bring them into the light. Because, and don't worry. You were worrying I was going to be sincere for too long. You're listening to a show called Snarky Faith. For God's sakes! Because I say things like this. Because there are leaders, pastors, prophets, grifters, people in authority that are unqualified to spout this shit, which I'll give you an example. Because this kind of stuff is unhelpful. This kind of stuff leans to that, just pray it away and it'll be fine. And this is a perfect example from one of the perfect assholes of the Christian faith. John effing MacArthur. Hey, he's written lots of books. He's said lots of horrible, mean things. Kind of looks like the Emperor Palpatine from Star Wars. He's that kind of a warm and fuzzy guy. And here he is giving his take on mental health. And I know it's going to be easy to go, oh yeah, it's John MacArthur being an asshole, because that's, it's what he does. He breathes, and he's an asshole. And that's just part of his nature. But not just to look at this for the abject awfulness and inane stupidity of the words that he's saying. But think of this from a position of a person that has power over churches, over other pastors, where his words matter. And think about Mental Health Awareness Month when you listen to this son of a bitch.
There's no such thing as PTSD. There's no such thing as OCD. There's no such thing as ADHD. Those are noble lies. To basically give the excuse to, in the end of the day, to medicate people. And Big Pharma is in charge of a lot of that.
That's kind of, I don't know if this is just conspiratorial or gaslighting that we have going on here, but the one thing we can say collectively that MacArthur is doing is he is speaking in a very uneducated manner, meaning that he has no idea what he is flippin' talking about in this at all. At all. He has no context, no idea, because he thinks the Bible has the answers to things that are more complicated than folks during the Bible times even could conceive of. But have no fear. He's going to break it down so you can understand his truth to the situation. And his truth really just sounds like an old dude that watches too much Fox News.
If you understand, take PTSD, for example.
Oh, please enlighten us on this.
What that really is grief. You are fighting a war, you lost your buddies, you have a certain amount of survival guilt because you made it back, they didn't. How do you deal with the grief? Grief is a real thing.
Yeah, okay, Boomer.
But grief is part of life.
What is this, like Snapple-cap wisdom?
And if you can't navigate grief, you can't live life.
It's almost as if he's having a new thought in his old decrepit brain there. Yeah, grief can be a big deal, but grief is not PTSD. Grief is grief. Trauma is trauma. But this old son of a bitch has got it figured out.
But if you clinically define that, you can give them a pill, a series of medications, and they end up in L.A. homeless on the sidewalk.
Such nuanced gravitas from such an empty soul of a human. I just love people that have had platforms for a long time and feel like that those platforms can give them the wisdom to speak on a myriad of topics that they are woefully unable to speak on. Now, I'm sure there's probably a MacArthur book out there on mental health or trauma or either way. I mean, it's garbage, but that's most of the books that he's written about the way that he reads scripture from a misogynistic, bigoted, hateful standpoint. And this is another form of that vitriol and hatred I feel like that he rolls with. Hey, you out there, you're in pain? No, you're not. You don't know pain, bitch. You've never been part of my congregation. Oh! Well, all right. It feels like we need a little bit of a palate cleanser before we get to the famous, the wise, the bearded? Sure, Keith Giles. We'll be getting to Keith Giles in a minute. But before we get there, we've got to get to, and we've got to get through, the Christian Crazy of the Week. Here we go.
If loving the Lord is wrong, I don't want to be right.
Lord have mercy. The Lord is my shepherd. He know what I want.
Well, in this episode's Christian Crazy, what we're going to do here, it's going to be short, it's going to be brief, but oh, is it chocked full of the world's tiniest violins. I know, because most people don't understand how difficult it is to be a pastor, how hard it is to be a prophet. It's not what you normies think it is, right? No, on the platform, we deal with stuff you guys wouldn't understand. You just wouldn't. Just because, we're God's chosen and you're not. So let's listen to some of the bitchiest holy rollers. And first off, in that category, we've got Jerry Seville. Jerry is part of the ministry known as Kenneth Copeland's Grifter Circle Jerk. And Jerry just wants you to know some things because sometimes he gets a little criticism coming his way because of the bling. But Jerry's going to tell you that you don't know. So serve it up, Jerry. Hot on a plate. We're ready for it.
I'm amazed at the people, Christian people, that fuss over God prospering people. I couldn't do what I do worldwide if I wasn't prospering. Brother Copeland gave you reports this morning. He could not do what he does, what this ministry does, worldwide, broke. That's the dumbest thing I ever heard.
Oof, Jerry Bear here is as greasy as they come. And you got to love how Jerry is just trying to speak, to the normal person out there, right? The normal person out there. And the best way to do it, and this is just why Jerry is just great, he's going to tell us a story about a time when he had to be around the unwashed masses. That's right. The time Jerry had to take a commercial airline. No! But Jerry suffers for the Lord nonetheless. Brother Jerry, tell us.
That's like I was flying back. My airplane was in the shop having some work done on it. And I flew commercial out to Los Angeles. And on my way back, I'm sitting there, and people are still boarding, and I'm sitting there. I like the bulkhead, and I like the aisle seat. And a man came in the aisle of the airplane. He said, "Brother Seville?" I said, "Yes." He said, "What happened to that vow of poverty? I see you're flying in first class." I said, "Well, sir, I didn't take it."
It's so fun when we get to have our let them eat cake moment in ministry. It's really a miracle moment.
A vow of poverty? Why would anybody take a vow of poverty? Poverty's under the curse, and we've been redeemed from the curse. Amen.
Amen, brother. Amen. Amen. Because really, 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 that is probably one of the most griftery gaslighting sessions that we've had in recent history here in the Christian Crazy. And you're going to say, that was disgusting, Stuart. That's just an aberration, Stuart. It couldn't get worse, Stuart. Well, don't you worry, because it's going to get worse. And now we've got Hank Kuhneman. Hank Kuhneman here is upset. He's upset because guess what? Prophets don't get enough pats on the backs, props. You know, they don't get enough credit because they're doing the hard work of God. I mean, they're the ones that are like listening and prophesying and making shit up. It's difficult. So let's listen to Hank being very honest and transparent here. Brother Hank.
And you and I hate sometimes, I'm just going to say, can I be extremely vulnerable? I have a 20-year track record, over 20 years of prophetic words. I don't know about you, when I read those words, my mouth drops. You know why? Because I don't talk that way. I don't think that way. But I know and I can feel God on those words. And I also knew who I spend time with. But what bothers me is people will discount vessels that speak for God, that have a track record and act like they don't matter, ignore what they say, and run towards fear. And then their things never happen, all the blood moon books, the Y2K storing up, kits, and they never get called out. And the heart of God that is spoken through true throne room vessels never get appreciated. Now, listen, I said a long time ago, listen to me. This isn't about me. Don't misunderstand that. Jesus made himself of no reputation. If you're going to speak for God, you better not be about your reputation.
Oh, it is not about your reputation, but you're making everything about this about your reputation. That's just kind of beautiful. I mean, anytime you've got a pastor that's got to throw down their resume before they give you an explanation, I think you should start questioning said pastor. And I just love how Hank's got to dig deep into this, like, oh, all of these other people that thought Y2K or the end of the world was happening, those people, they're crazy. But me, oh, my brand of crazy is way more relevant in these time and days. I mean, this is kind of, the pièce de bullshitance that, gift that God has given Hank. And it is hard, and Hank deserves our prayers because we don't know what it's like to be a vessel in the heavenly realms. I mean, it's difficult. It's difficult. But once you're a vessel in the heavenly realms, I think we step down into the earthly realms, and, a vessel's got to be filled up. And so the best way to fill up that vessel is cold, hard cash. I'm pretty sure he'll take crypto and anything else you got. Yeah. Yep. That's Griftership 101. A pastor who's really bad at being a prophet, but really good at profiting off of his marks. I mean, congregation, that's, how it goes. That's how it goes. You've survived this long through the Christian Crazy. Well done. Well done. And I'd promised earlier that we're going to be talking about the quantum sayings of Jesus. We're going to be talking through the Gospel of Thomas. What is this? Well, we're going to hang out with Keith Giles and do just that. So buckle up, get ready, because you need to put on your Sam Beckett hat because we're going to have a little quantum leap. Ow! With me again is Keith Giles, who's no stranger to the show. He's the author of the Jesus On series, along with books like Sola Mysterium and Sola Deus. Deus, thank you. That's way better. And now his new book, The Quantum Sayings of Jesus, Decoding the Lost Gospel of Thomas, is coming out. It's out right now. And so welcome, Keith. How are you doing today?
Oh, I'm doing really great now that I'm talking to you, Stuart.
Sweet talk me will get you nowhere.
Yes. Well, being honest, I have a busy life and a busy schedule, but these conversations are fun because you and I have talked many times before. I always enjoy our conversations. I get to talk about this topic, which I'm really interested in. And so this is fun. Thanks so much for having me on.
Now, I didn't mention which podcast that you're currently on because I know that's evolving and changing. So, Keith, what podcasts are you hosting or on right now?
Oh my gosh, so many. And it's going to get quote unquote worse or better, depending on your perspective. So right now I do 4 podcasts. I guess by the time this comes out, yes, I do 4 podcasts. So those are Heretic Happy Hour, which I started with Matthew DiStefano. We kind of started that together like 7 or 8 years ago. That is relaunching, and it's going to go weekly, or actually twice a week, with a rotating panel of amazing guests like Rainn Wilson, John Fugelsang, David Bentley Hart, Kevin Max, Jennifer Knapp, Derek Webb, Lainey Grant, on and on and on. Crazy panel we put together of different experts and stuff. So that's going to be amazing. Super excited about that. I do a solo podcast called Second Cup with Keith. Runs every other week. I do another podcast with Matthew called Apostates Anonymous. And I also do a weekly segment, an hour-long segment every week on Wednesday evenings on John Fugelsang's Sirius XM radio show, Tell Me Everything, along with, that's called the God Squad. And it's a recurring section, group. And it's me and Dylan Neighbor Cruz and December Rose. And that's a lot of fun. We kind of expose Christian nationalism, sort of people misusing the Bible for their own political, gains and things like that. And it's actually a lot of fun. So yeah, that's what I'm doing. I'm very, very busy. I'm either hosting something or I'm guesting on somebody else's thing on a regular basis. Yeah, in addition to shows like this.
Well, it kind of feels like if you throw a rock out into the podcasting world, one way or another, it's going to hit Keith Giles. With all the places you're at.
And there's a lot of people wanting to throw rocks, just trying to hit Keith Giles.
Fine. So I'll have to, maybe if we were to throw Nerf balls out there into the world too. Yeah.
Yes. Or change, money. That'd be great.
That's true. That's true.
No dollar bills.
True. Yeah. So in this book, Keith, that we're going to be talking about today, The Quantum Sayings of Jesus, Decoding the Lost Gospel of Thomas, what specifically drew you to the Gospel of Thomas for this exploration?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. Yeah, I'll be honest. When the first time I read the Gospel of Thomas, it was probably like 7 or 8 years ago. I was just curious about it. You can find it online and you can read the whole thing. There's 114 sayings. So I just read through it and I just thought it was the dumbest thing I'd ever read. I just thought, this is stupid. Anybody that thinks this is real is, they're a moron. It just was gobbledygook. Because really, when you just read it at face value, a lot of the sayings really, they're like riddles. So they just don't, what is he talking about, right? What does this mean? And so I dismissed it. I kind of laid it aside and said, yeah, that's not for me. And so I thought I was done, right, with Thomas. But somebody mailed me a book, literally mailed me a copy of this book. It's by, his name is William Duffy. And they said, you should read it. So I was going to take a trip. I was flying somewhere. I packed it in my bag. I'm on the plane. I read his introduction. And I really credit Mr. Duffy for kind of helping me rediscover the Gospel of Thomas, because in his book, he sort of cracked the code. He explained why it was confusing, why people don't understand it. He offered a very plausible sort of framework and filter for reading it and understanding it. And then he backed it up big time. Like, this isn't just a theory. Like, here's proof that this really is the right way to read it. And then as I continued to read the book and he went through the sayings, it did make sense. It was like, oh, well, wow, he's right. Thomas is seriously something to take serious to look at. And that book really is what made me want to dive deeper into the Gospel of Thomas. And since then, I actually reached out to him. I did some interviews with him, talked to him, thanked him for the book. He and I talked about Thomas and things like that. And that was really cool. And he provided a endorsement quote for my book, which was a lot of fun. So yeah, that was the reason why. I think if it wasn't for whoever it was, I don't remember now who it was, whoever sent me Duffy's book, Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Duffy, for your book, because it helped me to see why Thomas was, a legitimate text and something worth taking seriously.
I had a similar experience too. I remember when hearing about this years back and reading it and being like, whoa, like this is interesting imagery and there's interesting sayings here, but I had no idea what was kind of happening with it too. Yeah. And so in us talking about the book of Thomas, I think that we also, and you do this in the book as well, you give us like a history of kind of the Gospel of Thomas, and you also put it in place, which I thought was super helpful for me chronologically, like speaking in reference to the rest of the New Testament. Yeah. So can you kind of talk about like the timing and time period and all of that behind it?
Yeah, and this is fascinating as well, because again, Duffy made me kind of like go, oh, this is really good. But then I started digging sort of into the history, some of the scholarship behind Thomas to find out like who wrote this, when was it written, all that kind of stuff. I think my assumption was, I think like most people who kind of hold Thomas at arm's length, kind of skeptically, well, Thomas was written like 400 years or something later by someone totally different, because most quote unquote Gnostic texts, that's what they are, right? Like, no, this wasn't written by Judas. This wasn't written by Philip. This wasn't written by Mary Magdalene. These, it's like fan fiction, right? So I just assumed that was Thomas as well. And then what I was really cool to discover and excited to discover was that there are a lot of scholars, a lot of reasons to believe that the Gospel of Thomas is that it would fall. We put the dating of the writing of Thomas somewhere between the writing of the Gospel of Mark and the Gospel of John. Now that makes it a lot more legitimate. Suddenly now, okay, this isn't something that came much later. It's something that when Gospels were being written, and certainly the four that most Christians hold, dear, Thomas was around. And there's also reasons to believe, and I bring these out in the book, that whoever wrote the Gospel of John had read Thomas, because there's a lot of evidence that there seem to be specific passages of John that seem to be responding to things in the Gospel of Thomas. And there's also one of my favorite kind of like aha moments was I was going through the sayings, was I came across one of the sayings in Thomas that is a verbatim something that I remember reading in 1 Corinthians from the Apostle Paul. And when I looked up the text, when Paul says this, he says, as it is written, like he's quoting a scripture, and then he quotes Thomas. And I was like, holy moly. That's what really made me excited. So again, when I say a lot of scholars, would agree with that assessment that Thomas, there's good reason to believe Thomas was written somewhere between Mark and John's gospel. And that there are reasons to think that, Paul was aware of it. He quoted from it and things like that. And early church fathers did as well. There are, there's because scholars don't agree on anything, right? You can find scholars that say, no, it's much later. And I don't think this. And so people disagree on things. But the more I looked into it, and I present this evidence in my book, I think it's compelling to think that, yes, I think Thomas really does belong somewhere between Mark and John. And then the thing I should probably clarify about Thomas, sorry, I'm jumping ahead. Maybe you're going to ask me this. But when we call it the Gospel of Thomas, technically it's not a gospel. And many people would call it a Gnostic gospel, and it's not Gnostic either. So, Gnostic, when people think of Gnosticism, they think of some really wackadoodle theology about like some other demiurge God created our planet, and but it's not the Father of Jesus, and there's all these different spiritual beings, and anyway, that when you really look at, if you've ever looked at Gnosticism, it gets really strange and weird. And Thomas is not that. Thomas doesn't include any teachings along those lines, so it is not truly a Gnostic text. I think it's considered Gnostic because it was discovered along with other Gnostic texts, and we can talk about that in a second. But doesn't contain any Gnostic teachings. And it's not really a gospel in the sense, like when we think of the Gospels, usually there's a story of the life of Jesus. There's a birth narrative. There's, calling of the disciples. there's just all these things that kind of mark out a gospel story, right? There's the rest, there's the crucifixion, there's the resurrection, there's the sort of apocalyptic second coming. And you find none of that. None of those things are discussed in the Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas is essentially, it's really only a collection of the sayings of Jesus. It's 114 sayings. Jesus said, or maybe the disciples asked and then Jesus answered, Jesus said. That's it. Half of those 114 sayings are already in our New Testament Gospels. The other half are new. And so because of that, that's another one of the reasons why many scholars take it seriously. Because, again, think of it this way. If you were going to make up a gospel after Matthew, Mark, and Luke and John were already floating around in Christianity and early church, right? Everybody had these 4 gospels, and you're like, I want to write something that subverts that and kind of tells a different story, right? But you don't tell any story. You just include half the sayings are already in the other gospels, and you have half of them that aren't included, and with no commentary, and Jesus said, blah, 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 at the end. Like as we've said, most of the time people reading those things are coming away going, what does that mean? So that's not a really good way to sort of advance your agenda if you don't have an agenda present and you're not arguing or trying to make a case for anything. And so what Thomas is an example of is something called a Q document. And, again, going back to sort of New Testament scholars, a lot of New Testament scholars assume that when the authors of Matthew and Luke sat down to write their gospel, they had 2 things. They had the Gospel of Mark, because it had come first. They were basically borrowing from or stealing or copying from Mark. But Matthew and Luke, when they quote, Jesus' sayings, they quote Jesus' sayings exactly the same. And so the kind of the theory is, well, they must have both had something called a Q document, and that all that means is that it was a collection of sayings of Jesus, that they were like, they come to the part of the story and like, oh, Jesus said, hold on, let me find, let's use that. I'll just grab that quote. And that was a theoretical idea for the longest time. No one had a Q document. We've still never found what we think is the actual Q document. But when Thomas was uncovered in 1946 or something, I think I have it, the actual date. It was like, 1945. Sorry. When Thomas was uncovered in 1945, that was the first time we realized we had proof that a Q type of document did exist, because that's what Thomas is. Thomas is just a collection of the sayings of Jesus. And so that's these are the things that make Thomas significant, that make us realize like Thomas stands apart from these other Gnostic texts like Gospel of Mary, Gospel of Judas, and others, that they came later. They're by other authors. They do have stories. They're telling a counter story to the New Testament Gospels, whereas none of those things are happening with Thomas. And again, for the things I've said here, really good reasons to believe it belongs to be dated between the writing of the Gospel of Mark, the writing of the Gospel of John, and it's something that the early apostles and Christians referred to on a regular basis.
Now, where did everything then go wrong in this as well, too? For Thomas's, the Gospel of Thomas's history, how it's handled in the early church, where did things start to slide off the rails?
Yeah, and that definitely seems to be something that did happen early on. Because again, as we said, it's Paul the Apostle seems to be aware of it. He seems to quote from it without any problem saying, as it is written, and quotes Jesus from Thomas. Whoever wrote the Gospel of John seems to have some issues with some things in Thomas, but overall is affirming a lot of the same ideas that Thomas is affirming. So yeah, what's the big problem, right? What's the big beef? So it seems that historically what happened, and I want to just give a shout out to Elaine Pagels, an excellent New Testament scholar and historian, and she has a book called Beyond Belief that blew my mind when I read it. She kind of lays out sort of the political kind of posturing and background that was going on, the conflicts that were going on when this started happening. It's around the time of Irenaeus. And Irenaeus was an early church father. If you've studied church history, you've heard that name many times. So what Elaine Pagels talks about is that we really can't talk about early Christianity as if it was one thing. There were Christianities, plural. Like Barterman talks about this all the time as well. There were many, many different sort of flavors and types of Christianity. What I mean is, like, if you were to talk to those groups and ask them, who are you? They would identify and say, well, I'm a Christian. But some of them might have views and beliefs that were slightly different than what we now consider Orthodox Christianity. So back in that day, when Irenaeus was one of the church fathers, and he was surrounded by these other kinds of Christianities, and many of them he saw as a threat. And it seems that one of the ones he felt was one of the greatest threats to his personal sort of influence was a group they're called the Valentinians. And they were all Christians. Again, they called themselves Christians. Valentinus himself was a bishop. He was considered at one point to be a bishop in his region. He was passed over for that, but he was well known. People quoted from him. He was seen as a Christian. But he had certain things that he believed and that he taught, and those that followed Valentinus really liked the Gospel of Thomas. Right? They taught a lot from Thomas and from John, and so what Elaine Pagels points out is that it seems that Irenaeus really did not like Valentinus and his followers, and he felt that they were a threat to him personally and to the churches that were under his care. He sent letters. He told his people, don't teach from Valentinus's stuff. Don't listen to him. But the problem was many of them were already quoting him and using his stuff in there. So he had already lost control, right? And I think that only made him even more desperate to like kind of gain control. And so I feel like, and again, this is just not just my opinion. I think many scholars, Elaine Pagels among them, would say that when Irenaeus began to speak against and condemn the Gospel of Thomas, it's not so much what Thomas says as who is using it and reading it and preferring it. So that's what it seems to be. And we see that reflected as well. So Clement of Alexandria later on, he also condemns Thomas. He's just kind of repeating what Irenaeus is saying, like, oh, this is bad, don't read this. But then ironically, he'll quote from it. So it's like, yeah, so should I not read it or should I read it? Because you're quoting from it selectively here and there. And this seems that kind of continued up until around the time of Constantine. And so again, Constantine gains power. Constantine gathers, the Council of Nicaea. Athanasius is one of those church fathers, and Athanasius is on Team Irenaeus. And with sort of the political power of Rome and Constantine behind the church, I believe this is the moment where they realize, hey, we can send out this letter, and that's what Athanasius did. He sent it's called the Easter letter. He sent this letter out to all the churches, again with the authority of Rome, saying, do not use these books anymore in your services, in your worship times, in your teaching times. And Thomas is one of those books. Now, what's fascinating about that is, what that tells us is, before that letter, Christians everywhere were using Thomas and these other books in their regular worship. Until they were told to not do it, to stop doing it. And so we think that that's the time. It seems like it falls in the right time frame. That Thomas and other books were probably burned, destroyed. They were lost. But there was a seminary around Egypt that instead of burning them, they put these books in a large clay jar, carried it out to the desert, and buried it in the ground. And it stayed there from about like 340 AD, until it was accidentally discovered around 1945. And it was this literal time capsule of books. We had a complete copy of the Gospel of Thomas, which is fantastic. But some Gospels we had only heard about, had no copies of, like the Gospel of Truth, the Apocryphon of John. There's many other things that were discovered. This was at Nag Hammadi. And the Nag Hammadi discovery was fantastic. It was huge. And that's where we got Thomas from. So if you think about it, from around 340 AD until and it didn't get translated into English until 1959, And then I think they didn't even sell the like a copy you could purchase like in the stores until the 60s. So if you think about it, we've really only had Thomas, since I was born, kind of, to give you an idea. In my lifetime, we've had access to the Gospel of Thomas. But anyway, that seems to be the story as to why there was opposition to Thomas. And again, I would say not so much against what is being said in Thomas as opposition to the people that they didn't like or disagreed with who championed Thomas.
Well, you mentioned earlier too, when beginning to read and engage with this, it on its face, it can be very hard to understand. And you said earlier that something cracked the code for you.
Yes.
And when we talk about that, what shifted in you? Like, how did you begin to see this differently? I know you mentioned a book that you'd read, but like narrative wise or theme wise, what switched in your head?
Yeah. Well, the short answer is because Duffy goes through a very lengthy thing, and I repeat that in my book as well because to me it's the easiest way to explain it. But the short version is that the code, the thing that helps you read Thomas through a filter that helps make sense of the sayings, and this is again what Duffy suggests, is that everything that Jesus is saying to his disciples in the Gospel of Thomas is something to do with our oneness and connection with God, with the divine, and also our oneness and connection with one another in humanity. And so that idea is very similar to the sort of what quantum science is saying to us now, right? That even though we perceive the world in terms of separate objects, separate people, separate beings, that's how we see and perceive the world around us. We know on the quantum level that that's an illusion, that the reality is all of these seemingly separate objects and people and beings and planetary everything we can see in the universe, it's all one thing. It's all the quantum field. Everything is an expression of the one quantum field. So and also quantum scientists are beginning to talk in language that suggests that this quantum field is consciousness, that it is a sort of the great consciousness. And I've many quotes from quantum physicists who have said we can no longer describe the universe in terms of a great machine, that we should describe it in terms of a great thought or a great consciousness. And so when you realize that on that end, and you see what this kind of idea of what's being said in Thomas, and by the way, in many other mystical traditions, religious traditions around the world, it seems like, yes, okay, this seems like to be a really foundational idea that Jesus is communicating in Thomas. And so when you read Thomas and the sayings of Jesus in Thomas from this filter through this lens of whatever that saying means, he's trying to teach me something about this illusion of separation, and wanting me to see beyond that to the reality of oneness and connection. And and so when you read Thomas from that perspective, it really does kind of click. It seems to all come together.
Now, in your mind, how does that begin to shift how we hold things in Christianity? If there's this oneness, if there's this interconnectedness, how does that begin to shift the landscape?
Yeah. Well, it really does. And I think I was probably more open to these ideas at the time. It just kind of coincided around the time that I read Duffy's book, that I wasn't closed to these ideas. Because just really slightly before coming across Duffy's book, I was not open to this idea that Christ was in everybody. I was still very much embraced this idea that no, Christ is only in Christians. And, Christ isn't in you unless you invite Christ into your heart, and Christians are the only ones that have Christ living in them. And you can even see that in my Jesus Son books. I think the first 3 or 4 books I wrote in the Jesus Son series, I even argue for that. And then the later books that I wrote, like Jesus Unforsaken and some of the other ones, I actually argue the opposite. I contradict that and say, no, I was wrong about that. And my last book, I think in Solo Deus, I even say that. I talk about the fact that I was just wrong about that. But it took me a while as a Christian to kind of get to the place where I could see that, no, it really was true that Christ was in everybody. And what helped me, honestly, was the scripture. What was holding me back was my dogma, my sort of conditioning, which told me that, no, it can't be true, Keith. That's not possible. Christ can only be in Christians, which creates this sort of exclusivity for Christians, right? Only Christians have Christ. And I debated back and forth. Jamal Javanji was somebody that I want to thank him for continuing to. He was like a dog with a bone. He would not let me give up on that argument. And we went back and forth and back and forth. And my friend Chuck McKnight also helped me. I think Chuck was the one that finally really, really helped me kind of click. I was talking to him about it, kind of complaining that Jamal Javanji wouldn't stop arguing with me about this. And Chuck said something like, well, there is that verse that says that Christ fills everything in every way. I think it's in Colossians. And I looked it up and I read that. And then I think in Ephesians, it says that we are all filled with the fullness of Christ. And I kind of put those two ideas together. And it's like, if Christ really fills everything, Christ fills everything in every way, not just in a certain way, in every way, there just is no place to make an argument to say that Christ is only in Christians, right? So when Paul says to idol-worshiping pagans in Athens in the book of Acts, who don't even know he's talking about, right? He's talking about an unknown God. They don't even know who they're talking about. He just says, hey, this unknown God is the one in whom you live and move and have your being. Well, wait a minute, what? Like, I thought there was only Christians. So this is, it's a maybe a shocking, challenging idea for a lot of us who are raised as Christians or evangelical Christians for sure. But it's not a foreign idea to the scriptures. It's not a foreign idea to the Gospel of John. It's not a foreign idea to the writings of Paul. And certainly not a foreign idea to the Gospel of Thomas. It's just an idea that has not been emphasized. And again, we go back to this kind of tension between the proto-Orthodox Christians like Irenaeus and Tertullian and those guys up to Athanasius, and other Christians like Valentinus and several others who just had a different view, that they were emphasizing more of these kind of ideas, like that Christ is bigger than us. Christ is bigger than we can imagine. The love of Christ is like higher and wider and longer and deeper and all that. And they accepted all the same things that the proto-Orthodox believed, but they had this additional understanding that Christ was in everyone, and we were all connected to Christ, and we were therefore all connected to one another. And I think for me, when that clicked, when I really was able to embrace that idea that Christ was, that we were filled with the fullness of Christ, and that Christ filled everything in every way, and that there was no division or separation, right? Of course, now I'm open to this idea from that I see in Thomas. But it also makes me realize, this is what makes it possible for us to kind of do the things that Jesus said. So when Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, if I look at my neighbor and I see myself, it's easy to love my neighbor as myself because I see myself. I see connection with myself and my neighbor. Or when Jesus says, whenever you've done to the least of these, you did it to me. Well, then that I can, because I understand now this connection with Christ and the connection with all humanity, when I see the least of these who are hungry and thirsty or in need, I see Christ and I see myself. And therefore, what I do to them, I do to Christ. What I do to them, I'm doing it to myself. And so when Jesus says, love your enemies, again, the only way I can love my enemy truly is if when I look at my enemy, I don't see my enemy, I see myself and I see Christ. It just helped kind of close the loop for me on so many of the things that I feel are foundational to my Christian faith, that this is not a contradiction to it. And if anything, it makes it make more sense. And it sort of allows me to see how it's possible. Again, it takes this paradigm shift. Jesus is always saying metanoia, change your mind, think different. And this is a pretty radical metanoia, but I think it's the one metanoia. It's the one big shift that if we can get it, I keep saying this, I think it's the answer to everything, right? If all humanity could wake up and realize that we are all connected to the divine and we are all connected to one another. We are all absolutely brothers and sisters, kindred spirits, the same quantum expressions of the same quantum field, however you want to say it. If we really could embrace that, like, I can't go to war. How can I go to war with somebody I'm killing myself? I'm killing I'm killing Christ. How could I allow poverty to take place? Well, I see myself over there starving. I see Christ hungry. On and on. Like all of those things now, because I'm aware of and am fully embracing this connection and oneness with Christ and with all humanity, it sort of helps kind of awaken us to our shared humanity and our shared divinity. And it has the potential really to bring the kingdom of God, right? The way Jesus describes the kingdom of God to earth, where we study war no more, we care for the poor, the orphan, the widow. These things begin to become obsolete because we're no longer the kinds of people who can live that way, right? The only way you can live that way is if you really do believe that you're different and separate from those other people.
Mm-hmm. No, and you put this in the book, and I'm not sure if you're quoting somebody else, but it's like that shift from us and them to just us, that it's just all us. And
that's right.
And reading through it, I just found it a fascinating read going through it, because you take it just, is it verse by verse, I guess, is what they are in there?
Saying, verse by verse.
Saying by saying, in there. And for me, someone who'd read it before, I just kind of dismissed it. But the way you begin to unpack it, you're able to go, oh my gosh, I kind of get this now. I'm being able to see this. Like before, it felt like oftentimes it kind of felt like in faith that it's almost like we're looking through the wrong end of a telescope.
Yeah.
That we're kind of just like microscoping everything, even though I know the quantum field is very small.
Yes.
But I think our issues and stuff, I think we can tend to just zero in on stuff that separates us, that we don't believe in. But when we begin to expand it, look at through it the right way, we're able to see just a far greater field, that we are connected, that there is so much more to our existence than we see. And messages like this, I feel like, are perfect for the world that we're in today.
Yes.
We're very fractured. We're very separated. And it doesn't seem to be getting any less fractured and separated.
Right. Yeah, and I agree with that. And I think, I don't know, man. It feels like we are living in the most divided, fractured time, at least in my lifetime, if not in history. Like everything, social media, politics, religion, everything is us and them and us and them and us and them. And we're right and they're wrong. And they're not just wrong, they're evil. They're horrible. We have to get rid of them. We have to oppose them. We have to stop them. And man, this just leads us into kind of the chaos that we're experiencing now, where we've lost track of our connectivity. And it's funny too, like sometimes it can shock you. Because again, I think if you're just kind of swept up in that division, that sort of us and them way of thinking, and it's very easy to do that. Just the other day, I saw some kind of survey or poll that was done of Americans, and it was saying there's like the top 20 things that Americans think are very important, right? And it was things like, the right to vote, freedom of speech, equality for everyone, rights to education, rights to food and shelter, like all these simple, very basic sort of humanitarian things. And you ask people from all across, right? Christians, non-Christians, atheists, Democrats, Republicans, everything, all across the board. And there was almost like between 80 and 90% agreement on every one of those things. And when I saw the graph, and it was visually as a graph, I looked at the graph. I saw the article, but when I clicked on it, there was a little graph. And I'm seeing all the agreement. And I was like, it was like a shock. Like, because you assume that we're so different. You assume the feeling is we are just so polarized and divided. And we are polarized and divided, but not on the things that really matter.
Yeah.
And so, it's like there's almost nothing, there's not an equal force or engine or power out there on a daily, hourly, second by second basis, emphasizing our connection and what we have in common. What there is an engine and a force and a power emphasizing every day and minute and second how different we are. And that is what kind of perpetuates this idea, this illusion of separation that we're in, and leads to all sorts of division. It's not a good thing.
Well, I know, Keith, you agreed to this ahead of time. There are 114 sayings in the book, and I am going to put it in you ready? I'm going to give you a random number.
Okay.
I have a random number generator, and I'm going to run it real quick on Google.
Okay.
22.
Okay, so I should turn to saying 22.
Yeah, so read saying 22, and then give us your take on it to give people a flavor of what this book is all about too.
Yes. Okay, here we go. So this one's a little different. It has a little bit more going on than most of the sayings. In this one, it says Jesus saw, normally it's the disciples asking him. So this is what's different. Jesus is the one kind of that brings it up.
Okay.
It says, Jesus saw some infants who were being suckled, and he said to his disciples, "These infants being suckled are like those who enter the kingdom." They said to him, "Shall we then become infants to enter the kingdom?" And Jesus said to them, now here we go. "When you make the two one, and when you make the inside as the outside, and the outside as the inside, and the upper as the lower, and when you make the male and the female into a single one, so that the male is not male and the female is not female, and when you make eyes in place of an eye, and a hand in place of a hand, and a foot in place of a foot, an image in place of an image, then you shall enter the kingdom." And that's one of those examples of a saying that, the first time I read it, I was like, what nonsense. Yep. What is he talking about, right? All of that just sounds ridiculous. These are just ridiculous things. Make the inside like the outside and the up like the down. And what are you saying here, right? But again, if you say, okay, wait a minute, whatever is being said here, it's about the illusion of separation, that's not reality, even though that's what we experience. And that the reality is we are all connected to the divine, and we are therefore all connected to one another. So now when you read something like that, it's like, yes,
yeah.
The concepts of inside and outside, those are illusions, it's just as much as us and them, right? There is no inside and outside. There's just what is, right? All things are part of the same quantum field. They're just expressions of that quantum field. I also think this passage is very key to the final passage, the last saying, which is saying 114. And I'm kind of giving a spoiler, I guess. I don't know how far I should go, but basically the ideas in saying 22, if you really embrace and really get what he's saying, I'll just say this much. Saying 114 is what we would call one of the problematic sayings of Thomas. It's usually the one, and it's the last one. So you end on one that just feels like, what? And it just seems like Jesus takes this total turn, like this tangent, like what is he saying? It almost seems to undo everything he has said to that point. And that happens a couple of times in Thomas. But my argument is that those are legitimate sayings. I will say there's some, including Duffy. I mentioned Duffy a minute ago. When Duffy and I spoke, in his book, when he comes across these sayings that Jesus seems to sort of be out of character, he will say, well, I think this was added later by somebody else because it's not in character with Jesus and the other sayings. I take a different view. I'm like, no, I think Jesus is, that this is a legitimate saying. It belongs in there. But Jesus is often responding sort of facetiously or ironically. So in other words, he's probably frustrated with the disciples, which again, they're kind of clueless. Even in the, we know this from the New Testament Gospels, no matter how many times he tells them, they just never seem to get it. And so that happens in Thomas as well. So I think it's consistent. And so it's one of those things where sometimes they ask him something and he'll respond as if he's agreeing with them, even though it goes against everything he said. But if you look at the answer he gives them, I think, again, it's sort of tongue in cheek. It's sort of like, I'm going to give you the answer that you're expecting. But if you paid attention to everything else I've said, you'll understand what I'm really saying. And I think that's what's happening between saying 22 and the final saying 114. So, yeah, I mean, it's, and I go, this is a pretty long chapter. I'm not going to go into everything I talk about in this. But yeah, ultimately, the idea there in saying 22 is Jesus is just pointing out to them that to enter the kingdom, enter into this reality of everything being connected, they have to reach the place where they start erasing all those dividing lines, right? It's like that Naked Pastor cartoon. I love that one where everyone's drawing little boxes with a giant pencil, and his pencil is flipped over, and he's erasing all the lines. Now that's the short version of how to understand saying 22.
Thank you, because that I feel like that gives us a good taste of really what this book is that I found fascinating as I was going through. And my last question for you: this isn't necessarily about the book, but it is, Keith. You mentioned Matt, your podcasting co-host, business partner, etc.
Yes.
Matt, I had Matt on talking about hobbits. And so I had asked him, he obviously identifies as a hobbit. I was like, but who in this narrative where would you put Keith in all of this? And he very quickly said, no, Tom Bombadil, not at all, even though that you're very old and always been around. But then I think,
and by the way, I write lyrics and I used to sing in a band. So I would say maybe I am.
That was my suggestion, but he kind of went through that and said more Gimli dwarfishness. So we're not going to get into weird Tolkien stuff.
Because he's huge, by the way. If you don't know this, he is.
Yeah.
There's pictures of he and I standing together, and it looks comical. It looks like I'm standing in a hole.
Yeah, when you see like Matt standing full up, it looks like those old cartoons where you have like 3 kids with a trench coat on.
Yes,
and one at the top. That's kind of like Matt. Okay.
Yes.
So I'm going to take a different spin, since that's what he gave to you. We all know that Paul Rudd played Ant-Man in a movie, in one of the Ant-Man movies called Quantum Mania, since we're going on the quantum theme here. So obviously your superpowers are more writing books and of that nature. But if you're going to pigeonhole Matt, put DeStefano into a comic book character, give it to me.
Oh, so which comic book
it's like
character?
literary payback, I guess.
I got it. Okay. So which comic book character would Matthew DeStefano be? Oh my gosh. I'm going to say this is a compliment. I would say he's Reed Richards from the Fantastic Four.
Okay.
Because he's super genius. He's a very smart guy. He's very technical. He does, like, when it comes to choir, he does all the technical stuff in the background that I hate doing. I don't even want to know how to do that stuff. And Reed Richards is also Mr. Fantastic. He can stretch. And I would say Matthew is very flexible.
Okay. You're saying you're saying physically he's very flexible. So next time on the show, I need to see him as a human pretzel or something.
No, I don't mean physically. I mean like metaphorically. You know what I mean? He can stretch and bend and
gotcha.
Make it happen.
Nice. Well, Keith, thank you for your time today. The book is The Quantum Sayings of Jesus, Decoding the Lost Gospel of Thomas. It is a fantastic read. Keith, thank you for your time. And everyone else, you should check out this book. So thanks, Keith.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, thanks a lot, Stuart.
Well, that was fun, wasn't it? Much love and thanks to Keith Giles. And before I send you off, just a reminder to share the show, subscribe, and give Snarky Faith a review over on Apple Podcast. It helps get the word out to our listeners. And lastly, I just want to say thank you for being a part of this show. Episode after episode, week after week, month after month, I appreciate you all for being a part of this conversation. And as I release you out into this wild, wide world, I send you out with the holiest amount of grace and peace and snark. I'm out of here. Peace be with you.
This Squirecast podcast episode is brought to you by the Deadly Faith Podcast. Hey, heathens, I'm Lacey.
And I'm Lola.
And if you're deconstructing your faith and love true crime, then you need to subscribe to our show. On this podcast, we explore the world where religion and crime collide. We venture deep into cults, serial killers, and much more.
Now, this world isn't full of sunshine and rainbows, but it's a world that needs to be explored. We're excited to bring truth to light, so get ready for some deep dives and some funny commentary as we tell these religious true crime tales. The Deadly Faith Podcast is available wherever you listen to podcasts.